Earnings reports are like a trimestral report card for a business. It's the most consistent event to move a stock in a given direction. It's what matters. Or maybe better put, it's our window into what matters, a company's business performance. Last time we went over 10Qs and 10Ks, the official, fully vetted filings that cover the full details, quarterly and annual reports in their sometimes tedious glory. This time we're going to take a simpler format of that. We're going to look at the earnings filings along with the press release and the presentation that comes out. This is room for management to tell and sell their story to investors. They're still based on the real numbers, but there's more room for interpretation and for foregrounding things that management wants us to hear. This makes our lives on the one hand easier and on the other hand harder. Let's go into it. There are three formats I'm talking about, plus a fourth that I'll cover in the next video. We have the 8K, the press release, and the presentation. These overlap. The 8K is the public filing that is required. Almost every company will issue a press release on earnings. And then presentations depend on the company. Some issue them every quarter, some only once a year, some don't do presentations at all. You'll find the 8K on Edgar, the filings hub I talked about last time. It will almost always contain the press release and will also often contain the presentation. It won't all the time, and you can find the presentation and the press release on the company's IR website, their investor relations website. Sometimes it'll be there first. It's a matter of minutes or hours difference, so it doesn't matter in the long run. But if you're really eager to find out earnings because you already own shares or because you're really curious about a company, sometimes you want to get it ASAP and you have to go to the company itself to get the news. We can always just wait for the 10Q. So why do we care about the press release beyond the fact that it comes out first? The company will foreground certain numbers that it thinks are most relevant in a way that it can't on the 10Q due to the format. For example, we're going to use WD-40 in their recent earnings report. In it, we see right on the first page geographical segment information and product information, and some color or detail on why the numbers are the way they are. This information will be available in the 10Q, but it won't be as readily available as it is here. That foregrounding is part of a company's effort to spin the results. They can't make up any numbers, but they can put them in a context that fits the story they're trying to tell. WD-40 grew revenue 15% last quarter, but only 2% so far in their fiscal year. They blame that on currency changes. When the US dollar is strong, that usually negatively affects companies based in the US, as they get less out of the euros and the other currencies that translate into dollars. Often these press releases will feature a quote from a CEO or CFO. In this case, we have the CEO who praises the return to growth, but then laments currency for 2 sentences, and then puts the results in the context of constant currency, which adjusts the exchange rates as if they were the same last year as this year, to show how the growth rate has really been in the company's business view. It's spin to reframe the results in a way that's more favorable to the company. The 8K also has any news that the company would like to place more forward than it would be in the 10Q. For example, in WD-40's case, there's a share buyback announcement that they put in the third bullet, and that would be much lower in the 10Q. If a company makes an acquisition, they often announce it on the date of an earnings release, and they will announce it in the press release. If it's big enough, it'll get its own press release separately. The company's financial outlook or guidance for the next quarter or the rest of the year is the last big feature of the earnings press release. This is the company's current expectations for the months ahead and how the company will do financially. Not every company does this, and some companies save this for their earnings call rather than doing it in their press release. But when it is available, this is often the most impactful piece of information in an earnings report. While the report on the last quarter is important, that's already in the past, whereas the guidance and outlook for the months ahead is newer, fresher information and is subject to more variance. If you see a company that beats expectations for earnings and revenue for the prior quarter, and yet the shares still sell off, usually the culprit is the guidance and how it did or didn't meet investors' expectations. The aim of an earnings press release is in part to make investors' lives easier as long as we're willing to take management's framing at face value. What could do that even more? Pictures. That's the basic idea of an earnings presentation. We'll use WD-40 again, where we'll find their presentation not in the filing, but on their IR website. And we'll find how they translate the words and tables into a graphical PowerPoint format. The first thing I'll note is that they're actually using the real numbers, which is nice. They're adjusting only in the notes, so at least we're getting the real numbers right away. But we see their results right away. Then we see they spend 2 slides on the currency impact that we talked about earlier. So again, they're really hammering that this is something that's bothering them. Then they make some other clarifications, adjustments, and so on. They go into different segments and they give you more color on the business with a lot of helpful little arrows so that you can see what's going up and what's going down. Again, trying to make your life a little bit more visual and easier. From there, most companies will then transition after they finish the quarter into their longer term story. They're going to try to connect this and explain how these all go together. So when we get to the longer term story, we now see how the company has grown over time. We can see what their targets are by segment. WD-40 actually goes into more detail here than a lot of quarterly presentations do. They talk about their big challenges and what they're trying to do. And they even give us what their desired business model is, how they're looking, what margins they're looking for over the long term. This can be quite helpful. The presentation will at the end come back to the quarter and come back to the near-term guidance. And then something we'll talk about later, but not to be discarded, they do translate their adjusted numbers back to the real numbers or vice versa so that you can see how they connect. That's always helpful to have. Companies will also publish presentations outside of the context of earnings. They'll do an Investors Day every year or every several years. Sometimes it's a rare event, and they'll publish a presentation that analysts and investors can use to guide them. This will be more longer term focused, but it will connect to the earnings presentation. Usually they'll be built off the same template, and then a team will decide how much they want to curtail for the quarterly report versus the annual or the long-term investor presentation that's available on their website. Trivial example, Delta had an investor day in June. They published an investor presentation, and you can see their longer-term vision and what they're trying to do as a company outside of the context of how was this quarter and what do you expect for next quarter. Earnings reports are more ephemeral than quarterly reports or annual reports. They matter most when you already own shares of a company and you're trying to understand why the stock is moving up or down on a given day. At the same time, a lot of those moves are what puts a stock initially on our radar. And so it's useful to understand what happened to the stock, what might have moved it, and what the management team's story is. That's where earnings reports and presentations can be valuable. They also help us because the management team is spoon feeding their story to us. Not that we should just swallow it down willingly, but understanding how management measures itself and how it measures its business is valuable. We can see whether they move the goalposts over time, whether their story shifts in the right or wrong ways, whether they meet their targets and exceed them. All of these things can help us get a better framing to understand who we're investing in and whether we can put our dollars in their care. The last thing to keep in mind is that the press release and the presentation are the best face that a management team can put on results. You can take this in one or two ways. Cynically, you can ignore it, take the numbers that are more readily presented to you, and then run over to the filings and get the more straight-laced, dry version of the results. Or you can take the best face at face value, decide whether the story is attractive in and of itself, and if it's not, you can just set it aside and leave it there. Because if their best face isn't good enough for you, then chances are when you dig deeper, it won't be very exciting. I've been a little bit sarcastic about management spinning their results, but why wouldn't they? And why wouldn't you take advantage of that? Earnings reports and presentations give you a lot of the information that you need much faster than you can find in the annual reports and in the quarterly reports. I still like to go back to those reports to confirm everything and to dig deeper. But the earnings reports and presentations can show me where to get started, can be a quick introduction, and can often be a guide to those more detailed filings. You ultimately will need both, but as you're getting started with a company, and then especially as you already own shares in a company, you're going to get familiar with and appreciate earnings reports and presentations. There's still one more piece of the earnings report puzzle that I haven't covered here and I've only hinted at. That's what I'll cover in the next video. Earnings calls and earnings calls transcripts. Subscribe to this channel to get that video next week when it comes out. Check out shortinvestingguide.com. Thank you for watching and see you next time.